Good afternoon to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us via the World Wide Web on the Parliament's website www.ttparliament.org. We welcome you to our coverage of today's sitting of the Senate. This will be the 33rd sitting in this second session. As indicated in our House notes, there are some 12 papers to be laid, one report to be presented, 4 urgent questions, and 2 questions on notice. Debate is expected to continue on the Bail Access to Bail Amendment Bill 2017, and time permitting, debate is expected to begin on the Indictable Offences Pre-Trial Procedure Bill 2017. So we now await the arrival of the presiding officer to commence the day's proceedings.
The Honourable the President.
We welcome you to the 33rd sitting of the Senate in the second session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Thursday, July 6th, 2017.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Melissa Ramkisoon, who is out of the country, Senator H.R. Ian Roach, and Senator Sophia Choate SC, who are both ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. To Mr. Nikolai Edwards. Whereas Senator Melissa Ramkisoon is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Nikolai Edwards, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 6th of July 2017 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Melissa Ramkisoon. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's this 6th day of July 2017. To Mr. John Heath. Whereas Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of illness. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, John Heath, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 6th of July 2017 and continuing during the absence of Senator Hugh Russell Ian Roach by reason of illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's, the 6th day of July 2017. To Mr. Albert William Sidney. Whereas Senator Sophia Choate is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of illness. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Albert William Sidney, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 6th of July 2017 and continuing during the absence of Senator Sophia Choate by reason of illness. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's, the 6th day of July 2017. Honorable Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Nikolai Edwards, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, John Heath, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Albert Sidney, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Petitions, papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The annual audited financial statements of the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance Company Limited for the year ended December 31st, 2016. The annual audited financial statements of the National Commission for Self-Help Limited for the financial year ended September 30th, 2015.
Government business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the names of the Minister of Planning and Development, the Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts, the Minister of Public Utilities, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Public Administration and Communication, and finally the Minister of Sports and Youth Affairs. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Planning and Development to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Public Utilities to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Office of the Prime Minister to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Central Administrative Services, Tobago, to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Service Commissions Department to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. And finally, Madam President, the ministerial response of the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service.
Attorney General.
I regret I have no procedure paper before me, Madam Chair.
Leader of
If you
Government
just
business.
permit it.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay the following papers as listed on the order paper in the name of the Attorney General. The ministerial response of the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service. The ministerial response of the Equal Opportunities Tribunal to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service.
Mr. Vice President.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the order paper in my name. The response of the Elections and Boundaries Commission to the third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an examination of the system of inventory control within the public service.
Reports from committees.
Mr. Vice President.
Madam President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the order paper in my name. The fourth report of the Joint Select Committee on Local Authorities, Service Commissions and Statutory Authorities, including the Tobago House of Assembly, second session 2016-2017, 11th Parliament, on an inquiry into the regulation and licensing of medical doctors by the Medical Board of Trinidad and Tobago.
Urgent questions.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Good afternoon, everyone. To the Minister of Education, given that 2,170 students scored below 30% in the 2017 SEA examinations, will there be an evaluation of each student to identify and address his or her needs prior to entry into secondary school?
Minister of Education, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam President, sorry. These 2,170 students fall within two groups. The first group, students who are 13 years of age or older, those students will move on to secondary school. Students who are less than 13 years, they will be offered the facility to repeat the year and to resit the examination. And therefore, we have no immediate plans to conduct an evaluation prior to the entry into secondary school. Certainly, when school reopens in September, we will put things in place.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Would these students have been identified as having challenges before sitting essay, possibly through national tests or other mechanisms?
Minister of Education.
Yes, a number of these students have been identified, and our Student Support Services Division are liaising with our curriculum department in an effort to ensure that the necessary support is put in place for those students.
Senator Richards.
Given that the identification of possible challenges and possible remediation did not work, will there be an assessment of this remedial protocol to avoid this significant cadre of students from falling below the benchmark in the future?
Minister of Education.
There is always an ongoing reassessment of all the protocols that we have in place at the level of the Ministry of Education, and we will continue to do so.
Next question, Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Minister of Education, given that 2,170 students scored below 30% in the 2017 SEA examination, what immediate steps will be taken to provide remedial work for these students to prepare them, the ones who are moving forward, who are, prepare them for secondary school?
Minister of Education, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. While there are no plans to put in place any method of evaluation, we want to assure parents and indeed the national community that as soon as school reopens in September, we will be able to identify students with specific needs, and we will design individual programs to meet these needs. We will also be conducting diagnostic testing to determine the students' functional levels in areas of numeracy and literacy. We will provide guidance as to the alternative career paths that those children can follow. We'll conduct parent workshops. In terms of curriculum, we have put in place basic programs of work in the foundation areas of mathematics and language arts, and we will adapt and adjust the existing curricular programs to meet the needs of the students. At the level of school supervision, we will ensure that school supervisors visit schools on a timely basis so that where those students are placed, they will be afforded adequate time and adequate support. We will be meeting with the administrative teams of the schools to discuss the leadership and management arrangements to be put in place, and there will be regular monitoring of the schools and the aforementioned initiatives. Thank you.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, President. Minister, given the fact that now these students who have fallen below the 30%, who will, because of their ages, be moving forward to secondary schools, now will have to undergo the protocols that you kindly outlined a while ago. Are there plans by the ministry to provide extra support for the teaching staff, given that these students will now be faced with having to do Form 1 work in addition to remedial work because they fell below the 30% benchmark?
Minister of Education.
Madam President, I just stated that we will be conducting diagnostic testing to determine the students' functional needs in areas of numeracy and literacy. Where this is concerned, we are going to lay an emphasis in these two areas so that they will have the necessary skills before they move on. I want to use the opportunity to state that we need to look at the results of the SEA in two categories. We have been able to secure an improvement in the performance of the students because we moved from a 4% to a 13% success rate. And therefore, we are not only focusing on the students who fell under the 30%, but we are also focusing on those students who have done extremely well also.
Over 90%.
Yes, over 90%, yes.
Senator Richards.
Madam President, I'll be guided by your wisdom on this. I hope it falls within the remit of relation to the question. Does the ministry plan to reassess the 30% benchmark since it is not globally competitive?
No, Senator Richards. Yeah. Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Minister of National Security, can the Minister inform this Senate whether a security breach occurred when a man whose name was not on the guest list was allowed access to the office of the President to attend an event on Friday, June the 30th, 2017?
Minister of National Security, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I am unable to state whether any breach occurred at the office of the President with respect to the question asked. At this time, the ADC to His Excellency and the Commissioner of Police are looking into the matter, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, Madam President, could the Honorable Minister indicate how soon a report would be concluded by the ADCAR on this very important matter that has occurred?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, I'm unable to give any timeline as with respect to those answers, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
The President.
I wanted to also ask the Minister whether, as Minister of National Security, having regard to what has occurred, whether he intends to take any further measures to address this breach that has occurred in the apparatus of national security at the President's house.
Senator Mark. I won't allow that question. Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honorable Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. In light of the Global Peace Index report of 2017, in which Trinidad and Tobago has been named as the most dangerous country in the English-speaking Caribbean, what urgent measures are being taken to correct this negative image of our country?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, in answering this question, let me just quote from page 17 of the report. It speaks to, under the heading Central America and the Caribbean, of the 12 countries in the region, 5 saw their scores deteriorate, while the other 7 improve. With respect to Trinidad and Tobago, this was on account of a rise in military expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product and weapons import. So I'm showing the reason why our scores have deteriorated. Madam President, a quick look over the last 10 years saw the score being fluctuated roughly between 87 to 94. In 2007, for instance, we were ranked 94 in the global ranking. 2008, 98, 2009, 87, 2010, 94, 2011, 79, 2012, 94, 2013, 90, 2014, 89, 2015, 97, 2016, 84, and 2017, 97. Madam President, the matter of the image of this country is the responsibility of no single ministry, and in fact no single entity. The ministries, department, agencies, or person. Consistent with our development trust and overall objectives to improve the quality of life of all our citizens, the government of Trinidad and Tobago remains committed to pursuing a whole-of-government approach to achieving our Vision 2030 objectives. Trinidad and Tobago continues.
Minister. Honourable Senators, the time for urgent questions has expired. Minister, continue.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Trinidad and Tobago continues to collaborate with key international partners and agencies through which we benefit from technical assistance, training, equipment, and the exchange of best practices aimed at enhancing our criminal justice system. Madam President.
Minister, your time is up. Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate in the area of security and safety, given what we have been advised in this report, whether he's aware that Haiti, Jamaica, and even the Republic of the Congo is ranked higher than Trinidad and Tobago in terms of global peace? Are you aware?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, I want to repeat the reason why we are ranked as we are, and it's exactly from the report. With respect to Trinidad and Tobago, it was on account of the rise of military expenditure as a percentage of gross domestic product, and therefore it was based on our expenditure, military expenditure in particular. And therefore, in looking at those, we may have to monitor our military expenditure, percentage of gross domestic product, to treat with those issues. We have to bear in mind also that our military expenditure has in fact bear fruit in the sense of the large drug busts that we have, the largest in the last 25 years. So the military expenditure is justified to a large extent with respect to our vessels, support of our aircrafts, and so on. So we have in fact, again, it is a result of our military expenditure, and this is quoted from the report, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister of National Security share with this Senate what is the percentage rise in military expenditure in relation to the country's gross domestic product? You seem to emphasize a lot on that. So could you share with us what is the percentage rise, where it was and where it is now?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, I do not have the percentage rise, and in fact quoting from the report as the reason for our ranking. However, in respect of providing that answer, I can do so at a later time. The exact percentage rise in proportion to our gross domestic product.
Questions on notice, questions for all, answer.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, government will answer question number 99. I seek your indulgence and that of the House, the Senate, to defer question 95 to the next sitting, even though it was deferred already. The reason being that the Honourable Minister of Finance is currently acting as Prime Minister, and he couldn't attend the session this afternoon, and he personally wants to answer this question. So I crave your indulgence.
Madam President, is the Honourable Minister indicating that the person who is to answer this question will be visiting the Senate this afternoon to answer this question? I didn't get him clearly. I'm trying to get some clarification.
I said the next sitting of the Senate.
Well, Madam President, I don't have the standing order before me, but I am not prepared to wait until the next sitting of the Senate on the 6th of September or thereabout to get an answer. I would like to therefore invoke the relevant standing order by asking you to do the necessary.
The Mark, the relevant standing order can be invoked at the end of the question period. So let us just deal with the question, and then, yes, we'll deal with it. Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 99 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service received a report of pornographic photograph being posted on a local website in June 2016. This matter is at present under investigation by the fraud squad, supported by the cybercrime unit. To date, no one has been arrested, Madam President.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Madam President. Minister, could you indicate if the cybercrime unit has put any preventative measures to mitigate a possible recurrence of this? If there are protocols for that?
Senator Richards, that question doesn't arise, but you can ask another supplementary if you wish.
Thank you, Madam President. Minister, can you indicate when the investigation is completed, if the contents of the investigation can and will be made public in terms of public awareness, even if we sanitize it to protect the identities of the younger people involved, the minors involved?
Minister of National Security.
Madam President, that will be subjected to advice from the Commissioner of Police at that point in time.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, Madam President, with your leave, I'd like you to invoke Standing Order 29, no, oh, I am in the, sorry, I'm using the house of, yes, yes, I am using the House of Representatives. Yeah. Yes, Madam President, with your leave, I would like to invoke Standing Order 2715, having regard to the fact that this matter is outstanding for some period of time.
Honourable Senator, Standing Order 2715 will be followed through.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Mark.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I hereby seek leave to move the adjournment of the Senate today, under Standing Order 16, for the purpose of discussing a definite matter of urgent public importance, namely, the failure of the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries in overseeing the management of the Petroleum Company of Trinidad and Tobago Limited, Petrotrin. The matter is definite because it pertains specifically to the mismanagement of Petrotrin and the decreasing revenue generation by the company. The report of the Auditor General on the public accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year 2016 also set out that the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries could not provide evidence that oil and gas production data received from Petrotrin and used in the calculation of revenue collectible was verified by the ministry. The matter is urgent because given our economic hardships, the country cannot shoulder the added burden of another mismanaged and poorly supervised state enterprise. Additionally, Madam President, the energy sector accounts for approximately 34.9% of the country's gross domestic product, and our economy and energy sector is in dire need of innovation. The matter is of public importance because Petrotrin employs approximately 5,000 persons. If the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries continues to neglect this state enterprise, not only Petrotrin employees will be affected, but the livelihood of every taxpayer who has entrusted the government to effectively and efficiently manage the country resources. I thank you, Madam President, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I've considered the motion of Senator Mark, and I'm not satisfied that this matter qualifies under this standing order.
Public business, government business, bill second reading.
Honorable Senators, the debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the Senate adjourned on Tuesday, July the 4th, 2017, will be resumed. A bill entitled, An Act to Amend the Bail Act, Chapter 460. Those who have spoken on this matter are the Honorable Faris Alwari, MP, Attorney General, who moved the motion, Senator Wade Sturge, Senator Dr. Daneshwar Mahabir, Senator Gerard Ramdeen, Senator David Small, Senator Khadija Amin, Senator Sophia Choate, SC, Senator Wade Mark, Senator Pastor Clive Dottin. Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam President, thank you very much for allowing me to join this debate at this stage. Madam President, from 1994, when then Attorney General Keith Sobian, who like me came from the Mayaro constituency, it was landmark legislation relating to bail. I think previous speakers have established that that piece of legislation dealt with the common law practices as it relates to bail and other practices found in miscellaneous pieces of statute. But in a sense, it was landmark legislation. And from 1994 until this bill, every piece of legislation brought to the Parliament relating to bail has been in relation to putting things in place to make it more and more difficult for criminal accused to be granted bail. And Madam President, reflecting on 1994 and reflecting on the data relating to crime from 1994, it's almost surprising that the Attorney General at that time would have been minded to treat with something as like bail and set in train an area of difficulty in being able to access bail, and an area of difficulty that over a period of time became progressively worse. Madam President, before us is the only piece of legislation brought to this Parliament to deal with the issue of access to bail. It is the only piece of legislation. Every piece of legislation before this has dealt with the restrictions on the grant of bail. And that is a vital piece of information to start off with. Because I listened on the last occasion, Madam President, to every speaker. I would say first that Senator Sturge, who I always say I look forward to listening to, because he practices in the criminal courts. I listened, and towards the end, there were some suggestions from him. Senator Ramdeen, I would say, gave us a presentation in two parts. The first, very emotional. The second part, towards the end, some suggestions on how we can improve what is before us. And then Senator Choate, a series of suggestions on how we can improve. But let me first talk about Senator Ramdeen's contribution, Madam President. And there are two things that I want to address in that presentation. The first is Senator Ramdeen introduced the word floodgate. And Madam President, since Senator Ramdeen introduced that word in relation to this bill, I have had a very unsettled feeling, because it took me right back to the closing period of the last session of the Parliament. And in the last session of the Parliament was asked to consider, as had been done on several occasions before, the extension of legislation which put in place restrictive conditions for the grant of bail. And in particular, there were two changes brought by the last administration, which I, and I'm sure all the right-thinking people in this country, fully supported. And those were the amendments relating to the 120-day restriction, where bail could not have been granted to an accused in relation to certain offenses and in relation to certain conditions. In fact, Madam President, the second of those bills, the one brought in and moved by then Attorney General Gavin Nicholas in 2015, set out to introduce amongst the offenses for which bail could not be granted in 120 days, firearms offenses. And when Senator Nicholas brought that bill, I don't think there was a single citizen of this country who could have argued with that piece of legislation. Because, Madam Vice President, I don't need to go into the data, except to say it is well established that there is a link between the proliferation of illegal firearms in the country and the trend of murders rising over a period of time. And as I've said before, from 1999, which was the last year this country recorded murders under the figure of 100 a year. And also, I don't need to supply the data, but it's undisputed that the issue that had to be dealt with was the issue of persons out on bail committing similar offenses, in this case firearms offenses. And those two amendments from 2014 and 2015 aim to do more than what previous amendments had done. Previous amendments had dealt with issues like kidnapping, violent crimes. And I was surprised and disappointed, Madam President, that in this Parliament, the UNC, which enjoyed the support of successive oppositions in bringing amendment legislation as it relates to bail, that the UNC would not support the continuation of those restrictions in relation to bail. And if ever, Madam Vice President, if ever a floodgate was opened, it is that refusal to support the extension on the restrictions on the grant of bail in relation to a series of offenses, in particular firearms offenses. And that is a floodgate. Because, Madam President, this piece of legislation does not deal with the grant of bail. Those two pieces of legislation, both of which contained a sunset clause, and both of which were scheduled to expire in August 2016, by the non-extension of those restrictions on the power to grant bail within the first 120 days, that, in my mind, really opened a floodgate on this country, allowing repeat offenders who might have been restricted in their ability to get bail to be able to access bail and come out onto the streets of Trinidad and Tobago and re-offend, as all the data shows they are likely to do. The second point, Madam President, is this reference to the Malabar murders. And I think that there was absolutely no need in a debate on bail and a debate on access to bail to make a reference, and to make a reference to a newspaper article from The Guardian written by journalist something Lavende. Because, Madam President, there is now, until now, there is absolutely nothing to suggest, there's absolutely nothing to suggest that anything that happened on that day in Malabar, as vicious as the events were, absolutely nothing which suggests that it is linked to bail, it is linked to access to bail, it is linked to cash bail or bail by certified check. And it was purely emotions and purely an attempt to stir emotions. And you don't need to stir emotions in relation to those murders or any murders in this country. All of us are on record as indicating how we feel about crime, how we feel about murders, and how we feel. In fact, all of us.
Madam President. Amdeen, please, and members generally, cut the crosstalk, okay? If it can't be done in the way it is supposed to be done, which is not for me to be hearing everything, then cut it out. Continue, Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, it was no more than a cheap attempt to belittle the government using what all of us accept to be a most disturbing murder, or two most disturbing murders, as all murders are disturbing to us. So, Madam President, it is very important that we bring clarity to the debate, because it is easy to get carried away. Very important to bring clarity. And I will say three things in relation to the misconceptions, the misinformation relating to this bill. The first is that this bill does not interfere with the power to grant bail. So in this bill, the government is not adding to the power, and the government is not taking away from the power. This bill leaves the situation as it relates to the grant of bail exactly where Keith Sobian left it in 1994. That is where we are. And the only thing between 1994 and today that would have placed further restrictions on the court's power to grant bail was if the UNC last year had extended those two vital amendments which expired in August 2016. The second point I want to say, Madam Vice President, in relation to misconceptions, Madam President, in relation to misconceptions and misinformation. This is not the PNM government at work on this bill. And it is very important that we understand that. Let me just go back, Madam President. There are several instances where the former Minister of Legal Affairs, Prakash Rambharat, has taken full ownership of this particular bill, notwithstanding the fact, Madam President, that given the opportunity in the other place to speak on this legislation, he distanced himself completely from it. But it was May 2015, Madam President. I don't recall the circumstances in which he was prompted to talk about it.
Tell us.
It is May 2015,
Tell us.
in this Anna Ramdas report in the Express, under the headline, Ramada, now bail by check or cash. And it is Justice Minister Prakash Rambharat who is saying to the media, yesterday the Legislative Review Commission held discussion towards bail being granted to people not just by property deeds, but also by cash and checks. And he goes on. He goes on to regale the media about discussions held with Stephen Williams, the Acting Commissioner of Police, with the Commissioner of Prisons, and with other stakeholders, Madam President, with a view to advancing this piece of legislation that is before us now. So this is not P&M legislation. This is not P&M legislation. This is legislation that this administration is advancing because that party is no longer in government. And it does not stop there, Madam President.
Remind them.
As far as I recall, it was in November, and I referred to it in relation to a previous debate. It was in November last year that we laid in this Senate the first report of the Finance and Legal Committee. And that was a report on the inquiry into the criminal case flow management in the judicial system. And I sat on that committee, Madam President. I sat on that committee with Senator Sturge and with Mr. Rambharat. And as I always do when I'm amongst those who know far than I do, I listened very carefully to what they had to say. And we had a most engaging and important discussion as a committee when we interviewed the Inspector of Prisons, Daniel Khan. And I recalled on that occasion, Madam President, and it forms part of the report, I recall an intervention by Mr. Rambharat on this issue of bail and cash bail. And the inspector, Mr. Khan, had just completed the answer to a question which was specific to access to bail. He had just completed. And it is Mr. Rambharat who could not conceal his excitement, saying to Mr. Khan, I want to congratulate you on your expressions in relation to bail. And he goes on to say, I will tell you now that work had been far advanced in relation to the cash deposit system. And I find it troubling that it had not been instituted when I demitted office. Equipment had already been procured. And it was to be instituted in the month of September. And we are now in February. And I am hearing there's no step has been taken so far. This is Mr. Rambharat talking not just on bail, but also on electronic monitoring, and expressing disappointment in this committee.
He was one the minister, what?
Expressing disappointment that this matter of cash bail and bail by certified check had not been advanced, even though he had intended to have it instituted in September 2015. So this is not P&M legislation, Madam President. This is our legislation, historic legislation, brought here not to grant bail and not to restrict bail, brought here for the purpose of fulfilling the desire of a judicial officer to have bail granted. And Senator Sturge, Madam President, there's no question. There are two things that shocked me. One is on the flip-flop. Because if you go back to when then Attorney General Gavin Nicholas moved the legislation again to restrict bail and to introduce more onerous conditions relating to firearms offenses, well, the Hansard shows Senator Sturge in his opportunity to speak on that bill had a great time in the House, regaling the House about the importance of this piece of legislation. regaling the House of the importance of giving prosecutors those 120 days to get their case together. Even making the point at one stage that those 120 days were important to keeping witnesses live. And thereafter, flip-flopping on that issue. But it goes further. Because when I spoke about Daniel Khan, the Commissioner of Prisons, having a lengthy discussion with that Finance and Legal Affairs Committee on the issue of bail, it was, Madam President, in response to a question posed by Senator Sturge. And the records are there in that report. It was on 19th of February 2016. The committee interviewing Mr. Khan. And it is Senator Sturge who introduced this issue of bail, saying to Mr. Khan, now I am quite interested, quite apart from those who cannot access bail, particularly for murder. There are those who are now on bail but cannot access bail. You would agree, if measures are put in place, we can reduce somewhat the prison population if we assist those persons who are on bail but cannot access bail. This is Senator Sturge in a committee dealing with the important issue of case flow management in the criminal justice system, having an opportunity to interface with Daniel Khan, who by that time had written a voluminous report in relation to prisons, saying over and over through that report the importance of dealing with the remand yard, the importance of reducing the population in remand yard, and saying, in response to Senator Sturge's question, how important it was to deal with the issues of those on remand yard who had already been granted bail but could not access the bail. And Mr. Khan, in his response, took the committee through a comprehensive discussion on the importance of ensuring that where bail has already been fixed, that those who are entitled to bail be given the opportunity to access that bail. And I would have thought, Madam President, with the due regard that I give to my two colleagues on that side, Senator Sturge and Senator Ramdeen, with a history not only outside this House but in this House of dealing with the question of balancing the interests and standing in defense of constitutional rights, that they would come and speak and ultimately maybe vote in support of the denial of persons who are granted bail with a real opportunity to access that bail. Because if the sides were switched, Madam President, if the sides were switched, they would have said to us that it is not just access to bail, but real access to bail.
Exactly.
And that is what this bill is about. Expanding the opportunities, not limiting it to unmovable property. Expanding the possibilities and prospects for those persons who a judicial officer acting in accordance with the law as established in 1994 by Keith Sobian's work of giving an opportunity for those who are on remand yard and cannot access bail, giving them an improved opportunity to access that bail.
71% of it.
And Madam President, it was very interesting that while Senator Sturge was distancing himself from this piece of legislation, he embraced the electronic monitoring bill. And I wondered if he understood that the electronic monitoring bill works in two instances and two instances only. It works, Madam President, upon conviction as part of a sentence in relation to particular offenses. But the electronic monitoring bill also works as a condition of bail. So you cannot have the electronic monitoring bill and all the stipulations and all the opportunities in that bill if you do not have the opportunity for bail. And Madam President, one can envisage it. One can see that where a judicial officer grants bail and the bail can be accessed, the use of electronic monitoring can be applied so that you mitigate some of the risks that arise when an accused person is on bail. But what, in embracing the legislation, as normally happens on that side, Senator Sturge paid no mind to the fact that 4 years after the passage of that very vital piece of legislation, absolutely nothing was done to give effect to it. And the two work together. I agree with him. The two must work together, and it is not one or the other. The third thing, Madam President, is that somewhere along the line, and I forgive anybody who fell for the misinformation, the misinterpretation, the misunderstanding, not the Miss World contestants. I forgive them. But Madam President, it is Senator Choate who made the important point towards the end of her submission. And the most important point is that this piece of legislation does not introduce the concept or the use of cash bail in this country. And I don't want any of the senators sitting here to believe that this is something, this is the PNM and the Attorney General bringing legislation to introduce the use of cash bail in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, cash bail has been used, but Senator Choate made the important point. Just as in 1994, it would have been a consideration of then Attorney General Keith Sobian that by putting into one piece of legislation all the matters relating to bail, he would have been removing different applications and different use and different conditions applied to bail from court to court. He would have been streamlining. And what this legislation seeks to do is to streamline and to put into statute an equal opportunity for those who a judicial officer determine meet the criteria for bail to be able to access bail using some of the additional opportunities introduced by the amendment to Section 4. Madam President, we don't have to go far to find out that cash bail has been used in this country. I'll go back to several recent stories, but let me just take you back to this article which appeared in the Express on March 1st, 2015, under the headline, "Businessman in Court on Extortion Charges." And this case, Madam President, deal with a businessman who appeared in court charged with extortion and demanding a total of $204,000 by menace. And the charges were read. This was from 2006. The offense was said to have been committed in 2006. And in this case, Madam President, an extortion charge relating to the figure of $204,000, the magistrate, according to the article, refused the request for own bail and instead granted the accused $150,000 bail with clerk of the peace approval or a cash alternative of $75,000. This is the application of cash bail. And Madam President, this ought to be no secret. Also referred to in this article of March 1st, 2015, the article says the accused was represented by attorneys General Ramdeen and Wayne Sturge. So my friends over there are extremely familiar. As practitioners in the court, they know that this is not the PNM. This is not the PNM opening the floodgates to criminals and handing somebody the key to open the jails. This is the PNM dealing with something that already exists, where clients of my friends, I'm sure, have had the opportunity to access cash bail. And what we are doing here is that we are not making it applicable to certain courts and certain magistrates on certain days, under certain arrangements. We are introducing a level playing field where judicial officers, having determined that bail should be granted, would now deal with the access to bail on the basis of new conditions that are introduced in statute by amendment to Section 4. And that is what we're doing. Cash bail is not new in this country, Madam President. March 14th, 2017, Trinidad Guardian, under the headline, "Shooting Victim Fined $15,000 for Loaded Gun." The accused, a 20-year-old who pleaded guilty, and two other accused who pleaded not guilty and were each given $100,000 bail. The article in the Trinidad Guardian goes on to say they were also granted a cash alternative of $65,000 by San Fernando's Second Court Magistrate Margaret Alert. So it is not new. But Madam President, we also have stories, which is why we're here putting this into statute. We also understand, and the AG is very clear, that he intends to make it possible to be able to access bail. And right this week, Madam President, while we have been in here debating this, we see, for example, Trinidad Express, July 5th, 2017, under the headline, "Accused of Child Abuse, Woman Remains in Custody." And the article tells us of the lady who appeared in the San Fernando Magistrate Court on Tuesday. On Tuesday, while we sat in this house dealing with bail, on Tuesday, granted bail of $100,000, unable to access the bail and remaining in custody up until the night. Because that is what happens. And that is what the Attorney General is saying to us. This happens to be a lady in relation to an offense that has been in the news, a lady who has 8 children. And the court has determined, for whatever reason, and however you feel or I feel about it, however we feel emotionally about this thing, however we feel about crime, in the separation of powers, it falls to another body to administer the system of justice. And if, in accordance with the 1994 legislation brought in by Keith Sobian, the judicial officer grants bail, this bill before us deals with access to bail in a way that this lady, referenced in this newspaper article of July 5th, 2017, would be able to access
Minister,
bail.
you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
As you proceed, just move away now from the matter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Madam President, if you go back over the last 15 years, if you go back to the pronouncement of the judiciary, particular various chief justices as they deliver their annual statements and other statements, if you go through the debates in this parliament, you would see that this thing called access to bail has been an issue that has always been raised. What this bill seeks to do, it's a very short bill. It seeks to first, and I would say that the bill does 6 things. The very first thing is that it introduces the amendments to Section 4. And those amendments, Madam President, it introduces Section 4A, which sets out the 4 forms in which security can be given in relation to bail. Firstly, for those sums under $10,000, security in the form of cash or certified check. For those sums which are greater than $10,000, certified check. Thirdly, a bond issued by a licensed financial institution, or 4, as a charge on immovable property. And I know Senator Mahabir has spoken about the C part of it, the new 4AC, opening another line of business. But it is, as the Attorney General has said, Madam President, it is to clamp down on what exists now in the system. A system that works against people who are desperate to get the financial support in order to secure bail for persons or relatives who are accused and who are in remand yard and likely to stay there very long if they are unable to access bail. Madam President, the second thing, it introduces the opportunity to deal with the access to bail on certain hours and in certain places, the prisons in particular. And I just deal with the issue of the lack of trust, a very important issue. But Madam President, as it exists now, police officers are also charged with responsibilities in relation to bail. And you know, if you can't trust or if you can't put things in place for a prison officer to handle $10,000 in cash, then that prison officer should not be handling hundreds and hundreds of prisoners at the country's prisons. The third thing, Madam President, it deals with the issue of forfeiture and the power of the court to forfeit the bail in certain circumstances. And then, Madam President, it deals with the issue of where a person has posted bail, given the court with the permission of that person, and Senator Choate raised issues in relation to that provision, where the court can use the security put forward by the bail to not only pay fines out of it, but also pay compensation that may be ordered, all with the permission of the defendant. And I believe that is where Senator Choate had an issue. So, Madam President, in conclusion, this is not new. The issue of cash bail has always existed, and this is to level the playing field. This does not interfere with the grant of bail. This gives no additional power to grant bail or to deny bail. And thirdly, this, as I've said so many times, follows on the work of the persons who now sit opposite us, and they have not distanced themselves on many occasions from what they set in train. except that for political purposes. And when you go through the presentation by Mr. Rambharat in the lower house, you would see it was naked politics at work, as was emotion at work in this house. I thank you very much.
Senator Solomon.
Much obliged, Madam Chair. I'm pleased and humbled to make a small contribution in regard to this bill. Firstly, I want to compliment all my colleagues in the Senate, particularly on the last occasion, where 4 opposition senators, 3 independents, and 1 PNM speaker made contributions. Perhaps that's why the quality was so high on that occasion. Anyhow, I am pleased to see that Senator Rambharat has decided to join in the fray. He's always been most illuminating and a pleasure to listen to. So, Madam President, what is the purpose of this bill? The purpose of this bill is to amend the Bail Act and facilitate a movement away from the use of property as a means of providing security for accessing bail, and the introduction of the requirement for security by way of upfront cash deposits, certified checks, bonds, and charges on property. These are all things that were allowed by the Magistrates' Court in any event, and I suspect that what this bill aims to do is to encourage, to some extent, a movement towards encouraging the magistrates to accepting more along the cash, certified check, and bond aspect of the bill. Madam President, what are the proposed amendments in particular? And I'll look briefly at these as an introduction. The main proposed amendments are as follows. Clause 4 of the bill seeks to amend Section 12 of the Act by defining what is meant by security. And security may be given and received in various forms. Sections 4A to F describes these forms. Clause 5 of the bill seeks to amend Section 17 of the Act that allows compensation ordered by the court to be paid as fines into the court. So we see a major shift there. And Section 6 seeks to amend the Act by inserting after the 3rd schedule a 4th schedule to provide the days and times during which a prison officer designated by the Commissioner of Prisons can accept security for the purpose of this bill. Now, Madam President, I have to say that I do understand the difficult balancing act that the Honorable Attorney General faces. He's facing a situation on the one hand where he has a large number of persons on remand who may or may not be entitled to bail, many of whom have been granted bail, but cannot meet the said conditions for that bail. And I would reiterate that the highest law in the land is the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and that provides not only once but twice in the Constitution a fundamental right to bail. And this cannot be ignored. Section 4 of the Constitution outlines, says, the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, the enjoyment of property, and not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. And I want to come back to that later on at several instances in this bill where that may be offended. Section 5(2)(f) of the Parliament may not deprive a person charged with a criminal offence of the right to reasonable bail without just cause. So, Madam President, that's the fundamental basis upon which we have to look at all aspects of bail, and all aspects in a very serious manner, because you're dealing with the incarceration of people, many of which are presumed innocent until proven guilty. And the conditions under which they are kept also may be inhumane and unfair, and quite frankly, an affront to any civilized society. That being said, this may not be the panacea or the answer to solving these issues. And I hope that my contribution may be listened to by the government, and perhaps humbly some of them may be taken aboard, as have the contributions of my fellow senators. So in the opening, the Attorney General said that the number one issue facing this country is crime. And he hopes that this bill seeks to fix, in some small way, together with a suite of others, in fixing aspects of the criminal justice system and the prison system. I have no problem with that whatsoever, Madam President. I believe that he is right. I think that crime is the number one issue amongst a host of other issues, including the economic situation, unemployment, the education system, which we saw today with 2,000 students failing the SEA. There are many, many challenges that we face, including natural disasters, including flooding. We are in a terrible situation, Madam President, and this is a time when we need clear, focused leadership. And I will say, on behalf of the opposition, that we are not here to just fight and oppose for opposing's sake. We are here to work together with the government. If the government is successful, we are successful. And if we are successful, we can go home and we can enjoy a safe, private, prosperous life. So unfortunately, Madam President, we are here to work together to try and achieve a better country for ourselves. Now, Madam President, crime is the biggest problem in the country. And unfortunately, Trinidad and Tobago has had the unfortunate place as being number 7 in the world's countries with the highest crime rate. That was said by the Gazette Review, June 17, 2016, placing us ahead of countries like El Salvador, Brazil, and Kenya. In this particular study, Venezuela was number 1. And that in itself is disconcerting, given our close proximity to Venezuela. And I note a triple murder, including some nationals from Venezuela recently in the media. There's a large amount of trafficking in drugs and cocaine smuggling and human trafficking. And in fact, there was some Trinidadians who were recently arrested in Venezuela for human trafficking. So the proximity to Venezuela, which is now the number 1 highest crime rate country in the world, is also going to impact on Trinidad. And to turn a blind eye to that and bury your head in the sand is asking for trouble. Madam President, there is another study which was done, which was in the papers today actually, and it was in the Newsday, page 11, and it reads, Global report lists Trinidad and Tobago as the most dangerous in the English-speaking Caribbean. A title we could really do without at this stage. Trinidad and Tobago has been named as the most dangerous English-speaking country in the Caribbean, followed by Jamaica. This according to the Global Peace Index Report 2017, which ranked 163 countries. The most dangerous listed in the Caribbean are Dominican Republic, ranked at 65, followed by Trinidad and Tobago at 67, Jamaica at 72. So we now have officially surpassed, according to this global report, even Jamaica. And that is even more detrimental, more disappointing, and more a mark of our failure given our wealth and given our oil wealth that we now have squandered and find ourselves in a position where we, in fact, are more dangerous than Jamaica. And you can see the ramifications on an international scale. You can see that it's going to affect tourism. It's going to affect the economy. So, Madam President, I certainly agree with the Attorney General's assertion that we are in a situation where we've got to treat with crime, and we must treat with crime as the number 1 issue. And looking at the court systems and the prison systems is something that we certainly need to focus our attention on, but we must do it properly. Madam President, if you permit me to read where we stand. Cuba is 76, Haiti is 81, so we are ahead of Haiti. Guyana on the South American mainland was ranked 83. So we fall higher, more dangerous than these poorer nations. Syria has been listed as the most dangerous country for understandable reasons. The top 10 obviously are countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Central African Republic, Sudan, and Ukraine. And this report is not complied lightly. It's compiled by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It covered 163 countries, which accounted for over 99.7% of the world's population. They were assessed using 23 indicators on the level of safety and security in the society, the extent of domestic and international conflict, and the degree of militarization. So, Madam President, that is the situation in which we find ourselves. And the challenge now with the government and the opposition and the independent bench is to find good law, good solutions to assist the government in tackling the scourge of crime. I would say, Madam President, that the government's responsibility, as is delineated in the Constitution, is to keep the citizens of this country safe and secure. And right now, there is a feeling that nobody in this country is safe and secure. And I do not see how this bill in particular is going to do anything in the furtherance of keeping our citizens of Trinidad and Tobago safe and secure. A snapshot of the last week in the media and what's been going on in our country. Kidnapping for ransom, Chinese businesswoman murdered, double murder of caregiver and young boy, 13-year-old boy found dead with her 5-month-old baby. That, incidentally, is statutory rape of the highest order. 17-year-old boy found hanging at children's home in Valsayn. Father Harvey got hogtied and robbed. 11 boys escaped St. Michael's home. A home recently, which we're reading more and more in the papers, is rampant with sexual abuse, assault, rape, torture of these young children. These are the institutions which we entrust to look after these children and keep them safe. It is no wonder that they try to escape, because that sounds like living hell and a breeding ground for criminality.
Senator Solomon, you are putting your contribution in a certain context, but you're staying too long on the context and you're not dealing with the bill itself. So I need you to get a little more focus now on aspects of the bill or on the bill itself.
Much obliged, Madam President. These young men who have escaped, perhaps bail would have been a better option for them. The point is that this government has no plan whatsoever. This is not even a good idea. This bill is not a good idea. And if I could move to Section 12 of the Act, inserted Section 4A. And the proposition is that cash or certified checks in the amount of $10,000 or less and should be given as security for bail. So, Madam President, as I understand this proposition, is the thinking behind it is that cash will be more easily accessible, and therefore persons would be able to obtain bail easier. However, if you can't afford the bail granted by the professional bailers, as it were, which is 10% of the amount of the actual bail granted, there is no way that you will be able to attain the full amount of bail in cash. It defies logic. So let us say bail is granted in the amount of $100,000. And the man says, okay, you can do it $100,000 cash, which is encouraged by this legislation, or you can pay $10,000 to a professional bailer and get the $100,000 bail. Which option is he going to choose? He has no choice. $10,000 to most of these men is a far stretch beyond their reach. Far less $100,000. That's even more beyond reach. So you'll end up with a situation where this bill, now that magistrates are going to be tending towards to move the cash situation, you're going to defeat the actual purpose behind this bill. Because you're going to have less people being able to obtain the money and obtain bail, and then you're going to fill the remand yards, which are already overfilled, beyond capacity. So in my humble submission, this bill is badly construed and will have the absolute negative effect of what that is intended. No, I have heard arguments that cash bail tends to be less granted than that of property. That may be the case. Some have said, well, they estimate that 50% less. But even if you take the 10% of the 100,000 and you have 10%, 10,000, and you have 100,000, 50% cash of the 100,000, you still have $50,000 cash you have to get your hands on as opposed to 10,000. Doesn't make sense. Reverse effect. Incarcerated. Does not make sense. If you're telling me the purpose is to empty the prisons of these prisoners and let them loose on the public because they cannot afford the bail, well, this is putting more people in remand and more prisoners behind bars. I don't see the purpose. Madam President, where are they going to get the cash in the first place? We've read recently about a Newsday article dated June 30th, 2017, where kidnappers collected a tidy sum of $270,000 in Beetham for the kidnap of a businessman who was going about his bakery business in the wee hours of the morning. Within 24 hours, $270,000 was obtained. That is how they're going to get the cash. So you want to make it, why that this is dangerous legislation is because you're encouraging the criminal element to go after quick cash to get their boys out. Madam President, there's another aspect to it. When these people are allowed out on bail, and I'm not saying for 1 minute that they all deserve to be there, but when they do come out, and they may be paid, people may be paying cash on their behalf. The people who are paying the cash on their behalf may very well be criminals themselves with their ill-gotten gains. Drug lords in particular are full of cash, and they can easily afford to release 10, 20 men to go out and do their biddings, and they will be indebted to that drug lord, and they will have to go and earn their right to pay back the debt to which they owe those drug lords. What I see and what we see from this side is a crime wave coming out of this. Madam President, you have to consider the protection of the public, protection of the court system. The Attorney General said, and he said it quite clearly, this bill is designed to improve the court system. How are you going to improve the court system if you can't get persons to give evidence against criminals in criminal trials? And that is what we're faced with, because you're going to have a number of people out there who are going to get bail, and first thing they're going to do is they're either going to go after the very witnesses who are giving evidence against them in the first place so that they can get their bail money back, or alternatively, they would be bailed out by a drug lord or some other high-level criminal person who has access to that amount of cash, and he will send him to take care of other witnesses. And that is a major problem, because what we're hearing is that nobody is safe. People no longer want to give evidence. They will witness horrific murders, horrific rapes, horrific child molestation, and they say nothing, because they do not want their families to get killed. They do not themselves want to get killed. So when you're saying to them, cash equals further crime. Madam President, don't take it from me. It's widely reported. If I can refer to an article, witness opts not to testify in Maruga case, Saturday, April 16, 2016. The state's case against 6 police officers charged with murder of 3 civilians from Maruga in July 2011 appears to be in jeopardy, as its main witness has decided that she will no longer testify because of what he says are broken promises in the witness protection program. So, Madam President, 6 police officers charged with murder, no witness. We understand where we're going.
Yes, but just understand that if that is a matter that is pending before the courts, I would want you to treat with it with sensitivity. So you've made your point, and I'll ask you to just move past that point now.
Didn't intend to go into it in any great detail, Madam President.
Good.
I just want to illustrate the point of the danger that we are going into by this bill. By allowing the cash bail, there's a natural flow of events that would occur in the criminal underworld that will then directly rebound to the criminal justice system, that will then damage the criminal justice system, and then you'll not get convictions, and the criminals who may have committed the crime go away scot-free. And that is the ramifications by this bill. And if you can't look at the chain reaction, then you're stuck. You release 800 people on cash bail, you have 800 more persons on the ground indebted to the hierarchies in the criminal underworld. That can't be good for the country. Madam President, I heard my honorable Senator, Mr. Clarence Rambharat, Senator Clarence Rambharat, my apologies, and he mentioned that horrific murder involved with a young boy, Videsh, and his caregiver. The point, and nobody wanted to glamorize or politicize, but I think that he missed the point. The point was that this murder in particular was hateful and brutal and was designed to send a message purely because the victim had given evidence in a previous matter. And that was reported in The Guardian. And if you check the Hansard, as you should have done, you will see it. So don't come and try and say that, we are glamorizing crime and try and hide and put your head in the sand to pretend that that didn't happen and we shouldn't talk about it. You must talk about it because you have to deal with it. Madam President, I believe that before granting persons bail, one needs to look deeper into the defendant, into who the defendant is. And my comrade, Senator Sturge, he had said in no uncertain terms that they should split the offenses between summary offenses and the more serious offenses when considering bail. That certainly is a start. But I would go further and I would say that in foreign jurisdictions, for instance, the United Kingdom, social workers and probation officers work very deeply alongside the justice system, together with the psychiatric evaluation teams, psychiatric nurses and doctors, because they recognize, after centuries of jurisprudence, that everybody who is before the courts is not a normal, sober, run-of-the-mill person. A lot of them are vulnerable and need deeper support in order to move forward. It doesn't appear as that part of our judicial system has been neglected, which is why we find ourselves in situations where the weak, the vulnerable, the children, and the women in society are the ones who tend to suffer the most. And we've seen a viral video the other day of a lady assaulting a young 2-year-old boy. What hope do we have if those aspects are not addressed and those aspects are not identified and dealt with? So my submission is that we need to before we release people on bail, we need to know what people we're releasing on bail. What is the risk impact to the society? Are they likely to recommit offenses whilst on bail? Are they likely to recommit violent offenses? What are their known affiliations? Are they linked to criminal gangs? Are they known to have a violent past? These are things that I think need to be looked at in deeper detail to understand who we are dealing with. You can have a hardened criminal who's been released on bail on very serious offenses, or he may have been freed and then commit a lesser serious offense, and under the summary offenses may be released on bail. But he is no ordinary person who may have made an obscene language, or maybe is there for non-maintenance of paying for his children. This is a different category. Now, yes, the man who may be there for obscene language, or the person who will be there for non-payment of maintenance, they should be automatically granted some form of bail once it is decided that they are not a risk to the society. And that is the key to the whole thing. That is the key to understanding bail, is understanding the people who are before you. You can't take a high-handed approach or broad brush approach without ignoring the social services aspect, the probation officers aspect, the support services in terms of psychiatric. I mean, we have a situation where persons who are mentally ill are being killed. There's a new one today. And I spoke about it in my last contribution, where 5 mentally ill people in the past 2 months have been murdered. And today again, another young man was murdered who turned out to have mental illnesses. We are totally inequipped and people are dying as a result of it. And to me, that is unacceptable. So that shows that when you consider bail, you must consider the services, consider the institutions that go along with them, and utilize them. You can't just lock people up en masse and expect it to work. Because you're going to have people who are there, as I've said before you, and the Attorney General made the point, and it's a valid point. So pity he's not in the chamber right now, but it's a valid point. He said that, you know, it's a fact that if you put in young offenders or vulnerable persons into a situation where they're there with hardened criminals, some have been convicted for very serious offenses, and you lump them all together in a cell 10 by 10, inevitably those persons are going to come out hardened criminals too. And that can't be acceptable. But if you choose to ignore that social services side and intervene and separate, then you're going to be in great difficulties. And we have the facilities. We have the facilities, and these people need our protection. They don't have any other protection. When I saw the video of the 2-year-old naked boy running down the street.
Senator Solomon, please, I've just asked you about certain matters that are currently engaging the court's attention, and I'm asking you to just treat with it sensitively here. All right? Now, you've made mention of it. Please, you don't have to be bringing it up all the time in your contribution. And by the way, I'm going to ask you now if you could just try once again to focus more on the bill, please, and the issues arising from the bill.
Yeah, that's you do. Madam President, Section 4A, and I accept your ruling, and I beg your forgiveness, because sometimes one does get carried away. These are passionate things which I feel passionately about, and I feel as though we are failing, and I won't go further. So, Madam President, I want to make the point, Section 4A, which says cash or certified check where the amount of security is $10,000 or less, B, certified check where the amount of security is greater than $10,000. And we're dealing with the professional bailers. And we dealt, I think, in large to do with that. Now, Madam President, if I could move on. You have to ask yourself, and this is what's so peculiar, is that the magistrates have the power to grant cash bail. And in fact, they do it all the time. And yet still they choose often to go with the property bail. And it appears to me that no study has been done as to ask them, why do they do that? And it is said that that this is an illegal practice and it shouldn't be tolerated, and we need to outlaw that and get rid of that. I would prefer to look deeper into it, into the social aspect, and understand why it exists. The magistrates, they are qualified. They sit down there day in, day out, dealing with literally thousands of cases. They are in contact with the people before them. They're in contact with the police. They're in contact with the system. And you have to ask yourself, why do they constantly do that? And there must be some positive reason for that. And to pass a law like this, where you're imposing on them a cash situation, when they prefer to use another, that begs questions. And you see, the Attorney General says, well, Section 18 and Section 19, that outlaws it. It makes it completely illegal. I'm not saying no, but I'm asking the question. Section 18, and let's look at Section 18. Section 18 of the Parent Act reads, where a person agrees with another to indemnify the other against any liability which that or other may occur in as a surety to secure the surrender to custody of a person accused or convicted of or under arrest for an offense, he and that other person are guilty of an offense. And I'd ask you to look at that word indemnify. Now, indemnify means compensate totally. In insurance terms, it means you suffer a loss, you're totally indemnified for the losses that you have suffered. That is not what is happening here. What is happening here is persons are buying a service for 10% of the value. It's a loan. It's a loan. So I'm not even so sure or convinced that this is illegal. What is illegal and what is the spirit of what this is designed to do, and that's something that we don't do enough in this jurisdiction, is to try and look behind the spirit of the law of what is intended. And this is intended, I put forward, is that when persons say, okay, you stand bail for me for $100,000, you come out of bail, you're outside now, you say, look, partner, thanks a lot, but I ain't going back. I'm giving you $100,000 back. You ain't going to lose nothing. I free, everything good. That is indemnification. And to me, that is what Section 18 is designed to cover. This other bill of billing cash is not going to cover that, you know. It's not going to stop the use of professional bailers. That is a red herring. That is a red herring. We are trying to outlaw professional bailers because it's an illegal act. Well, if it's so illegal, how come the magistrates use it every single day? Section 19 of the Act says, it's an offense for a person to stand surety on the consideration of property, which at the time of standing such surety is being used as security for the purpose of standing surety for any other person unless the approval of the court is first obtained. Second, a person is guilty of an offense under Section 1 is liable on summary conviction to imprisonment for 2 years to a fine of $3,000. What is the issue with that? The issue with that is that you don't want people running around using deeds for 3, 4, 5 persons.
Exactly.
How do you solve that? Not through this bill. This ain't curing that. You just need to computerize the system. How could you tell me that this law is going to computerize the system? How could you have a magistrate's court that doesn't have a properly computerized system? In the first place, it blows the mind. But you're going to invent law to cover that? That, again, is not acceptable. Now, oh, really? Really, you're in charge now, man. Please. The blame game is over. We're not here to blame game. You know.
Senator Solomon, if only you would address the chair, you would not get sidetracked like that, okay? No, I'm not asking for help from anyone. And once again, I say, desist from the crosstalk, please. This is the second time I've made the request. I'm not going to ask again. Senator Solomon, continue.
Madam President, to me, this is serious business. This is people's lives. This is our country. This is the criminal system. These are criminals who are running loose. This is a matter of human rights, treating people fairly, people who are incarcerated in atrocious conditions. These need serious analysis and serious deliberation and serious debate. I'm not going to spend up nights researching this stuff for it to be belittled.
True.
Madam President, I want to say that even the late Dana Sita Hall, she said in an article dated 20th April 2012, She said Trinidad and Tobago it is an open secret amongst the fraternity in the criminal justice system that professional bailers are the mainstay of the bail system. This is so even though this is said to be against the law in this country. Her choice of words is interesting, as it always has been with Dana. This is said to be against the law. It's an open secret amongst the fraternity. Everybody knows it goes on. And these are lawyers, eh? They're not going to be doing anything to break the law. So, really, wow. Madam President, poor people cannot have difficulty in accessing property. It is known. They have certain hurdles they have to overcome. There are inherent problems. The deed must be clear, as you say in the courts. No mortgage. It must be unencumbered. There's a letter of discharge. You must get a certified copy. You must have a valuation. Some courts say the valuation of the property must be 6 months. It must not have been used for other defendants. These are major challenges for poor people who probably don't even have the property in the first place. Mm-hmm. And when you're hitting $150,000, $250,000, $300,000 bail bonds, you're faced on top of that with all of this. You may even have the property, but you may not have the letter of discharge. That takes time. All this time, persons are sitting in your family member or your loved one may be sitting innocently in the remand yard, waiting for these things to be organized. You also need land and building taxes. So, Madam President, you have a situation where you have a professional bailer. He's outside the court. He's ready to go. He getting your boy out. Quick time. Magistrates knows he's being used. Everybody knows he's being used. 10% is paid because that is what is affordable, and bail is granted. Why not legitimize that entire process? Why not legitimize the entire process? But no, this government wants to push this whole thing towards the banks. Now we want the banks to make money out of the situation. 1%. And I've warned the Attorney General, I've told him before, justice is not a ministry to make money. Don't come here to try and make a revenue earner to balance the books to pay for your oversized budgets through justice. Justice is something that has to be done, it has to be seen to be done, and it has to be fair. You cannot take into consideration costs. And now you want the banks to be profiteering. How much does a bond cost? How much is the poor man going to pay for his bond? How much is he going to pay for his certified check? The bank's going to be making our money? How the banks reach into this picture? I don't know. I don't know. They're not making enough money as it is. Poor people suffering to pay the banks. Now it is that we have to go and let them go and face the banks. The government supporting that? I don't understand how the government could be supporting that. And then you come into me with FATFA and and FIU and so what? You're going to have drug lords now bringing thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, rushing it into the banks to get their boys out on bail and get bonds from the banks. What you're doing literally is legitimizing and money laundering money legitimately. Why are you tinkering to the system? You know, they say, the Attorney General always saying, follow the money, follow the money. Well, I'm following the money and I'm seeing what's happening here. I would say, and I would humbly say that I think the poor people prefer the current system. And they need to consider legitimizing this entire process. Tell us what banks, tell us what it's going to cost, tell us the fees, tell us what is going on. I mean, it reminds me, you know, when you're trying to put poor people out of their little businesses, it reminds me of the second-hand car dealers. When they put them out of business, so other big businessmen who sell new cars now in business. It reminds me of the 7% internet tax, which again put in small people out of business. This PNM government is an elitist government, masquerading as a government for the people. Unacceptable. No. God save the PNM boy.
God save we.
Madam President, there are a number of articles I would have loved to refer to. Maybe the Seattle Times article on 7th of June 2017, jailing the poor and releasing rich 60% citizens. That talks about the system that has been employed where certain jurisdictions are moving away from money bail and moving into the more risk assessment part of it, which is something that I suggested and touched on earlier. I would like to put some positive things forward. I would like this government to focus on using alternative, there are technologies out there. Madam President, this government has got to go. They've got to go. Great is the PNM.
Senator Solomon, your time is up. Senator Creese. Members. Senator Solomon. No, hold on. Too many people getting carried away now. Too many. And I'm asking, I said I wasn't going to ask again. But Senator Solomon, your time was up. When your time is up, you take your seat. Okay? Senator Creese.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I begin my substantive contribution on this bill to amend the Bail Act, I think there is need to clear the air or to deal with some of the subliminal messages that are crisscrossing the stage, that are underlining much of the discourse. And I have a concern that there are some things that are a bit unsaid, and for the casual observer, visitor from abroad, well, students have left, needs to be put squarely on the table before we go forward. So permit me just a few minutes to deal with that. And it struck me when the issue, I think, suggested between Senator Sturge and Senator Ramdeen on whether these amendments will open the prison floodgates. And I think it was Senator Rambharat who this evening referred to the presentations of Senators Ramdeen and Sturge on the question of prison floodgates being opened. But underlying that really is a perception, as we speak of crime and bail for people who are accused of criminal activity, we are really thinking of violent crime. And that is unsaid but constantly implied. And I think in going forward, we need to come to some kind of understanding as to whether there's a pecking order of crime and whether violent crime is in fact way up in the pecking order. And how does that stand vis-a-vis white-collar crime? And which is the greater violence? The physical blood violence inherent in your average hold-up or kidnapping? Or the crimes that are perpetuated against generations yet unborn in terms of white-collar crime? Because when we speak of the floodgates being opened by this bail bill, we are in fact suggesting that violent elements are going to be let loose on the society. And from this we all cringe. And I have a problem because there's then an inherent support for this bail amendment because the focus is on the perpetration of violent crime. And I'm really truly unsure that acts of corruption and crimes against humanity, even unborn humanity. So I thought there's need for us to seriously reflect on this, lest we get carried away and opt for this amendment because our eyes are set on violent criminals, or our perception of violence is that of blood and gore, as opposed to the whisking away of millions, either through tax avoidance schemes or whatever mechanisms men or women may come up with to raid the treasury or to raid whatever common, institutions there are. And in that sense, we cannot deal with the perspective of crimes of violence without the geographical space that's associated with it. Because inherent in all of this are certain geographical spaces, whether we say it or we don't say it, that are linked to the notions of violent crime. And I make no bones about putting it into Hansard that yes, the majority of us are thinking of places like Laventille and places like Beetham and places like Sealots and some parts of Enterprise. And when I was growing up, it was some parts of Hyderabad. But there's all kinds of psychoses. There's all kinds of subliminal messages that prevent us from seeing the thing clearly. And whatever we do here with this bill, amendment bill, inherent in it must be the capacity to liberate places like Laventille. And as I move off that generic subject and come to the particulars of the bill, I can't help but note with great irony that there's a place in Laventille called Picton Road. And for those of us who are unfamiliar with who and what Governor Picton is famous for, and for those of us who have been in power and saw no need to correct those subliminal messages by changing the name of that place. Because I will just refer you to the public library and who Governor Picton was and what he did to a certain woman of mixed ancestry, for which he eventually was charged, and what he did to several other people all over the British Empire. And we've had changes from PNM for how many years to NAR, to PNM again to UNC, to PNM again to UNC. And no attempt has been made to deal with the psychological and subliminal messages that are inherent in the persistence of those names and those places that are reminiscent of a very violent past. And I'm not here talking about crimes against the treasury, but crimes against humanity. So read up on Picton, friends, colleagues, and perhaps a government will come that will see the need to deal with all that violence that is inherent in our history that we try to sweep under the carpet. So that they come directly to the amendments themselves. And there's a provision for cash or certified check where bail is 10,000 or less. And for the use of certified checks, sums over 10,000. which takes us, that's at section A, and which takes us to 4B. And 4B introduces the role of the Commissioner of Prisons and the prison officer as being someone to process bail. On paper, it sounds like a good idea in terms of providing, Creese opportunity, Creese avenue for the quick processing of bail. But that is tied to 4E. And at 4E, there's a schedule of days and times when these payments can be effected. And apart from the comments, I think, made by Senator Ramdeen about going with cash up that lonely road, so there's no need to repeat that. What I found interesting looking at that schedule was that it's Monday through Saturday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, 8 p.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturday. So it would appear, and this is where some of the institutional biases come into play. Clearly, there's a prohibition against Sundays. Is that a Christian prohibition? Sunday, because it's a public holiday, justice grinds to a halt? Is that the intent? And if we are saying that here every creed and race finds an equal place, then what of Seventh-day Adventists on Saturdays? How are they to fare in that scenario? So we need to be careful that what we are about is consistent with the provisions of our Constitution. The fourth schedule is inherent with problems. But on the one hand, it is good to see that there is an extension of the provision of bail service by including the commissioner. But the class bias that's inherent, the institutional bias that's also inherent, and the religious bias that's also inherent is cause for concern. I think one of my colleague senators on the independent bench says, well, there's access to the bank up to midday Saturday now, thereby implying that, at worst, is only one day the prospective accused may be forced to stay in prison. If we are to take seriously the tenet that someone is presumed innocent until proven guilty, the 1 hour processing in the police station is too much, far less one day. You see, we have to make up our minds. It's either we pay lip service to this concept that you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, or we are serious. And if we are serious, then one day, Sunday, of all days, is too much for the innocent man. So are we, because our perspective on violence and violence crime, are going to cheaply sell the notion that this man or woman may be innocent, and one day, Sunday of all days, whatever your religion, you end up in the Western societies being a family type day. One day is too much. So the presumption of innocence has to be there until the man's day in court is over, and the jury, or if it's tried by judge, finds him guilty. Otherwise, we end up like that thing we used to see in those Western movies. Accuse him, arrest him, hang him, try him and then hang him. Because we don't know he's guilty. Presumption of innocence must have weight. And in what is supposed to be the highest court of the land, this place, here most of all, that notion should be firmly planted in our mind's eye as we go through this bit of legislation. But there are some other questions we have to ask ourselves. Because as I listen to the various presenters, senators, the question comes up all the time. Do we trust the police? Do we trust the prison officers? Because we cannot expect to reach very far on the reduction of crime and the management of law and order if we haven't come to terms with the fact that two of the critical institutions involved in the whole question of crime and rehabilitation of criminals, the police service and the prison service. So do we trust the police? Do we trust the prison officers? And perhaps I will add to the confusion and give you a quick police story. And this story came out of my early public service as an investigator in the Office of the Ombudsman. The issue that often came up was the question of the service of warrants. Many a time, and I would probably one day ask the Minister of National Security, through you, Madam President, as to what percentages of warrants are served and not served and are outstanding. Because there was this maintenance warrant that was outstanding at a particular police station in a remote rural area. It was a maintenance warrant. And the contention was that the gentleman concerned could not be easily found. The gentleman, to cut a long story short, the gentleman concerned was a cleaner in the relevant police station. Cut a long story short. Me save on my own time. So that's a police story for you. I don't know whether that leaves you better off on the question of do we trust the police.
Oh, Lord.
And I will give you a prison officer story. And this, like the police story, is repeated ad infinitum. It's like a serial. Remember the old days of serial? You're very old, Senator. It's like a serial. And the story goes like this. So somebody is charged for a violent crime, could even be rape or sexual assault. And he's in remand. And he's conveniently placed in a cell that has the relatives of, or friends of, or neighbors of the victim. Anybody wants to hazard a guess as to what is his fate on the first night he is in that cell? And whether the prison officers are complicit in placing him there? That's the prison officer's story. If you are to take this further, then the question is, are we just expanding the opportunity for revenge within the system by widening the avenue of participation of prison officers in the bail system. This is Trinidad and Tobago. This is the 21st century. We cannot afford to be naive. This is the highest court of the land. The buck stops with us. So are we clear in our mind's eye that we really want to do this? That the risks involved aren't mind-boggling? I think it was Brother Valentino who has a line about mankind running out of time and space. Well, I've joined the police bashing by my police story. I've joined prison officer bashing my prison officer story. So justice would demand that I turn my attention to, I think it's Section 5, which deals with the whole question of the court's role in applying any part of the bail with the victim's, the accused's consent to the payment of his fine or to any compensation due the victim. And the question there, which brings me to the third pillar in the whole judicial and jurisprudence system, the court itself. Question of time and space. And the question that comes to mind is the High Court, like the Industrial Court, have they been tried and found wanting? Juxtapose this against the question of a judicial officer retiring and or resigning with critical unfinished matters. I don't think I have to give any specifics here. I don't think it's necessary to relate like I did a police story, to relate like I did a prison officer story. I think we all know the judicial story. The two has complained endlessly about industrial court judges. There's a classic case of one involving Texaco that took about 20 years to deliver. And recently, I think the president had to intervene and disappoint and reappoint somebody so that the matters left pending could be dealt with. And even more recently than that is the example I won't go into. But we all know. So, the first amendment to the amendment I would like to propose to recommend is that at 5 here, a time frame be set. If the judge is to do anything with those monies deposited by way of bail, there should be a set time frame for doing it at the termination of the matter, after which the monies are to be automatically refunded. We cannot allow the little money that the poor people gather to take the sun out to be languishing. We just cannot allow that. So that there should be a time frame once the judicial officer is interfering with the monies placed for the bail, there should be a time frame for the disposal or the disposition of that, so that you don't have somebody dying, somebody resigning, somebody retiring, and the poor people money jumping up literally in steel bar. But there's a larger issue once we are talking about money. About the question of plastic and the use of plastic. And it would appear to me that it is time to drag the judicial system vis-a-vis the whole bail question, screaming and kicking into the 21st century. Plastic is here. And to share with you another story, the reason why I got involved in the credit union movement, way back in the 80s, I was attending the Northwest chapter of the League. And at that time, I was more substantively a member of one credit union, but roped in to one of the committees of another. So I was in two credit unions. And the credit union from which I had a mortgage, the president of that credit union had returned from a conference abroad. And I'm talking here, this is in the 80s. And someone asked him, well, you know, what is it all about? He said, well, they're trying to get me to use plastic and then machine. And this was around the time, it was the very year in which Marianne, the Workers' Bank ATM, was introduced in Trinidad. That's where I remember it. And he was so skeptical of this plastic. And I said, you know, that's a turning point for me. I'm not going to have much to do with the credit union that had my mortgage. I'm going to stay involved with the other credit union because they were more proactive. And he was adamant that that was a waste of time. And I was saying, but here are these poor people. Take the money and send you up to the States to a conference to get you on the cutting edge of the technology. And instead of taking your credit union forward, you are dismissive of the new trend. So I'm saying all of this to make the point that wherever government institutions on the whole, not just for the bail system, not just for the prison, wherever government institutions on the whole are not keeping abreast of the times, are not into plastic money in a serious way, then we are wasting time. We are certainly wasting technology. And at this juncture of our history, where we need to be more cost effective on all fronts, we cannot afford not to be fully plasticized. And the irony is, if the subject, if the subliminal message, if the thing that has us all cringing in our homes behind the burglar proofing, behind the alarm systems and the vicious dogs that guard our gates, if it is the fear of home invasions and violent crimes, then you have to go plastic. As Senator Ramdeen pointed out, you really don't want to send anybody up that lonely road by the prison with $10,000 in their pocket. That of itself is a crime. It's to set people up for criminal intent. And I won't be a party to that. This is the 21st century. And you see, we need to recognize and to see the extent to which law has been a tool of social control. And not just the question of the codification of norms and values, but increasingly, particularly in Caribbean history, how we entrap, how we enslave people. And there's a sense in which law can easily degenerate. Legislation can easily degenerate into instruments of oppression. And our sacred duty as a Senate and as part of the Parliament is to ensure that the Senate strikes a blow for a new perspective in jurisprudence. And I don't know the extent to which we realize that the move away from property-based bail is significant. It is significant because property has been an instrument by which the lower income groups have been kept in their space. The right to vote, universal adult suffrage, was preceded by property as the basis for voting. So it was only between 1945 when the act was passed in 1946, when the first elections under universal adult suffrage took place, that Trinidad experienced this. Before that, sexism, women being kept out, even racism, because the history of our legislatures, and we need to be wary, is replete with examples where our legislature was part of a racist-oriented system. The requirement that the East Indian indentured arrivals have to pass a language test, an English language test, before voting, is what that was all about. So the challenge has been to break down these barriers, these artificial barriers that sought to keep certain groups relevant and certain groups irrelevant to the political process. So there's a sense in which we could see that expanding bail opportunity beyond property is in fact a good move. But we have to be careful that we don't become the willing tools of a new class of entrepreneurs, and that the state finds itself enjoining a battle between entrepreneurs. That is, as I think Senator Salmon pointed out, there are a group of people who are entrepreneurs in the field of facilitating bail. And whether it is our intent in this legislation to rein them in and invite a new set of business people who really don't need the business because they've been declaring untold profits, but invited them in to this area. But as I pointed out, it has been the role of our successive government regimes, administrative regimes, to pay pensions to bank accounts and not credit union accounts. I say no more on that subject. But here we find ourselves bringing the banks into a new area of business, a new boom and bust for them. But it is part of our history for our regimes to do this, to indulge in almost like class warfare against their own people. Because after the Moran Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, the then legislature in Jamaica, and they had assembly-type government, voted themselves out of office, voted a return to Crown Colony government to keep the emerging quote-unquote mulattoes and free blacks from ascending to political office. Our history is replete with these kinds of examples, where the state takes sides in class warfare. So the Senate, has to resist
Senator
the
Creese,
temptation.
you have 5 more minutes.
Oh. So the Senate has to resist the temptation to take sides and elevate one class of businessmen over another. The other thing I think that comes out of this is that as the recession deepens, the demands of the moneyed groups for a greater share of the national pie will increase. But it's against that background that the challenge of this Senate, of the legislature on the whole, is to delineate a new perspective for jurisprudence. And as in when I was referring to the fines that the traffic bill, as amended, proposed, the point I want to make, and I want to take a little more time this time to get that across, is that as presently structured, our fines and bail is much the same. Our fines relate not to people's income and earning capacity, but to some other standard that bears absolutely no relation to economic situation. And I made the point then, as I do now, that the driver of a super elite vehicle getting a fine of $5,000 or $10,000 or $1,000 does not have the same relationship, same consequence as the driver of some foreign used vehicle, some local used 20-year-old vehicle that he paid $10,000 for, paying a fine of $1,000. That is fundamentally unjust. And the inability of this society to recognize how that is unjust speaks volumes of our sense of justice. And bail has the same issue. Because the ease with which somebody could raise bail of $100,000, whether cash, surety, or whatever for, and the ease with which the average resident of a low-income place, like the Beta, could raise that money, speaks volumes of our understanding, our concept of justice and equity and fair play. Because bail for the guy who works for $150,000, $200,000, $500,000, $1 million a year, and bail for the person who's just at the tax border, $60,000 where you're not paying any taxes, right? Cannot be the same. Cannot, by any measure, be equitable. So that we need to peg our fines on income. And I'm saying that the quantification of bail has to have that same basis. Otherwise, we are perpetuating an old order of jurisprudence that punishes the poor. Madam Chair, I want to close by making the point that the challenge in this bill, as in the traffic amendment bill, is for us to strike a blow for new and innovative ground, and not add to the stock of woes that our people collectively have had in the past. We need to take stock of the quality of justice that has been the lot of our people and resist the temptation to continue with more of the same. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Samuel.
Madam President, I want to thank you for the opportunity to join in this debate. Debate on the bill, an act to amend the Bail Act, Chapter 460. Madam President, the issue with regards to the present scenario in Trinidad and Tobago is not so much the issue of bail, but is the issue of the inefficiency of a judicial system. A judicial system that has caused citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to be held primarily in remand and suffer the consequences based on the inefficiencies of the system. It is a fact that people are left to suffer behind bars because of a poor system, and no one can ever argue against that, because speedy trials are not readily available in Trinidad and Tobago. And because of the poor system, we have found that in the prison systems, remand and as well as others, we have a tremendous congestion of people who are accused and yet not sentenced. I would have thought that in piloting this particular bill, that we'd have had some data seeing that there is this move to grant cash bail, and I'm not talking about anything else, to people who have been incarcerated and who have found themselves a victim of a poor judicial system, that we would have found the information given to us, we would have had the information given to us of how many people in Trinidad and Tobago are presently on bail. How many persons on bail would have had their bail rescinded? That would give us an idea of the operations of the system. How many people who have been on bail died while they're on bail? As a matter of fact, Madam President, we've had some newspaper reports, Daily Express, May 17, by Susan Mohammed, Michael Jacobs of Princestown, shot dead, recently released on bail. Daily Express, January 15, 2016, Labrie man who was recently released on bail, shot dead outside his house. Guardian, December 13, 2013, man released on bail, shot outside Port-au-Prince prison. He was on $30,000 bail. So we have a lot of situations that we need to look at. Not only that, but how many persons who were on bail committed subsequent crimes and were rearrested. Those are the kinds of data that I believe is essential for us in determining the outcome of this particular debate. As a matter of fact, Madam President, it is essential for us to realize that on the judiciary's website, and it was reiterated by Senator the Honorable Clarence Rambharat, that cash bail is no new thing, reiterated by Senator Senior Counsel Choate. And according to the judiciary's website, cash bail, the person who is presenting himself as the surety for cash bail is required to show proof of the source of funds. This requires the production of a recent bank statement, usually not more than 6 months, to the clerk of the peace. So I understood from the learned Attorney General that this is supposed to be sort of reducing and assisting in the whole judicial works and bringing down and relieving the tensions that are in the system. But, Madam President, if I may quote in the Newsday, "Make access to bail easier" by Jada Lautu, Sunday, December 4th, 2016. President of the Single Fathers Association in Trinidad and Tobago, Rondell Fields, is calling on Chief Justice Ivor Archie and Attorney General Faris Alwari to dispense justice with a human side and make bail accessible to the poorer class in the society. According to Fields, the administrative system at the St. George West District Magistrate Court, Port of Spain and environs, which requires accused persons who were granted cash bail by a magistrate to produce a bank statement for the previous 6 months to prove that their bank account had sufficient funds to cover bail, was arbitrary and unfair. In other words, the average person, the poorer class, still can't get bail because they can't prove that they had $50,000 in their bank for 6 months. So this does not help the situation. Which poor person has $50,000 in their account to say, okay, I had this in my account for 6 months, and as a result of that, it can be acceptable? That is a strange phenomenon that we are trying to ease the system, but the system is not set up to even ease itself. Madam President, not only that, but the former learned counsel, Dana Sitahal, said in an interview in the Daily Express, April 20th, 2012, that the court has been reluctant to utilize and embrace cash bail. She said, occasionally courts, and she was dealing with the whole issue of bail in TNT, occasionally some courts may accept cash bail, but for administrative and other reasons, most magistrates appear reluctant to embrace this option. So the question has to be asked, Madam President, why? Why are magistrates reluctant to embrace the situation of cash bail? And what are the other reasons given? We were not told that there was such an issue by the magistracy. In other words, what was the problem? Why is it that they can do it, but they now are reluctant to embrace it? What is the situation that is causing magistrates not to want to do it? Those are the kinds of discussions that we need to have, Madam President. And as a matter of fact, I found out in a statement in the Daily Express entitled "The Free World," published on November 5th, 2016, and the publisher is Senior Counsel Sophia Choate. And I would like to quote, Madam President, Senior Counsel Sophia Choate. In dealing with the administrative issues when it comes to cash bail, so really, unless we deal with the administrative issues, instituting and attempting to embrace cash bail will continue to be an issue. I want you to listen to Senior Counsel Choate, Madam President, if I may read to you. It is difficult for the average person to understand how bail works. The reason is that the law seems to be sealed off in a silo where legal arguments are made in the courtroom, and then there is another silo which houses the dreaded phrase, approval bail. If someone is granted bail, the order may say the bail is granted in a particular amount with a surety to be approved by an officer of the court. That person is usually the clerk of the peace in the magistrate's court or in large catchment areas where there are more senior administrative staff by the clerk of the peace, 2 or 3. And I'm going somewhere. Among the documents which the bailer or surety must provide is a clean deed, and we know that. And this is to say a certified copy, not a photocopy of a deed of or certificate of title for a property which is not mortgaged. Many people have paid off their mortgages thinking that is all you are required to do. Not so. You need to have the bank or the financial institution with which you took your mortgage prepare and register a deed of memorandum of release. Another requirement which people are not familiar with is that even if the certified copy of your deed shows that the purchase price of your property is equal to or more than the figure given in the court order, you still need to have a valuation report. So it just gets more tedious. That's why people are not getting bail. And this is where it starts to get a bit hazy, Madam President. Some courts, and I use the word in its administrative sense now, require that the report should be no more than 6 months old. Others 3, there is no reason for the difference. Now I come to cash. Senior Counsel Choate. Courts are now prepared to grant cash bail as an alternative to bail with a surety. This means that the production of a certified manager's check made out to the senior magistrate is brought to the court. It is received by the cashier and it should be deposited into an account and returned upon the conclusion of the matter. Initially, the check was made out to the clerk of the peace, but this was changed, and without sufficient notification to members of the public and or their attorneys. If you go to the judiciary site, you can find an explanation for what cash bail is, and I just did that. This week I discovered, Senior Counsel Choate, that the cash bail in one district requires just what I've described above. But in another district, the surety is required to produce bank statements for the previous 6 months to prove that the account always had sufficient funds to cover bail set 6 months down the road. In other words, there are disparities. There is no connection between one district or the other. In other words, what appears to be acceptable in one district is not acceptable in other districts. In a small country like Trinidad and Tobago, people cannot be asked to respect a system which is arbitrary and constantly in flux. And this is what has been the position with the approval of bail orders for far too long in Trinidad and Tobago. Why is an order of the court blocked by administrative checks which are unnecessary, invasive, and punitive? Why should a surety have to disclose his financial affairs to the clerk of the peace? How many people are now going to have access to those documents which carry the surety's name, address, account number, and account balances? In other words, Madam President, when you have this kind of situation, your private financial matters are made public to people in the system. So, if for some reason they see a financial statement where you have a lot of money, You may have to set up some cameras at home. You may have to find 10 Dobermen, 2 German Shepherds, and you will have to have security by your gate because now your financial matters are made public. Those are the problems. This is, by the way, by Senior Counsel Choate.
Yeah, man.
So, Madam President, it is not just about bail. It's about what protects the people who are going to put up the shelves, the people who are going to stand there. What protects them when the system demands that their financial status be made public or open to the clerk of the peace, open to any clerk in the system who, you know how it goes, Madam President, not everybody is everybody. Madam President, so we have a problem. There is an administrative issue. And that administrative issue has not been addressed by the learned Attorney General because that is something that is real and practical. Not only that, in the bill, Section 4 of this amendment, it talks about where bail is granted to the defendant. Now he includes the idea of the prisons being able to accept monies, bail. Madam President, but I went up on the prison's regulations. And the prison's regulations, number 127, where it talks about the receipt of monies, says that the steward shall receive all monies paid for fines, not bail, so this have to be amended. Work orders, prison properties, and see that the same are promptly brought to the account and paid into the treasury. It's important for us to take note of this. So in other words, is the present regulations of the prisons open up sufficiently so that the prison authorities are now given the reassurance and the legal right to collect such large sums of monies that will be now walking through their system. Madam President, I happened to visit the prison systems recently with a joint select committee. I went to the remand yard, I went to the women's prison, I went to the maximum security prison, I went to Port of Spain prison, and Madam President, I was so baffled that I saw a lady, she was standing outside for a long period of time, and then we were inside and she came in, and she was standing by this old area with little benches and all dim and looking, you know, all scary. And I wondered what on earth she was doing there. And then I found out she was paying a fine. And I said, that is how they treat people who come to pay fines in here? It is terrible. And it means that the system is a mess, and now we go in and make people walk outside. She stood up outside for a while, you know. Could you imagine standing up outside the Port of Spain prisons with a large sum of bail money on the pavement? Madam President, cars are stolen outside there, no? You know how much cars are broken into right outside now? The prison officers have had to access a car park to secure the thing. You know how much cars are broken in now in Golden Grove? They have a particular area cordoned off for cars of the officers. Why? Because when they park to the side of the roads, many a time they come back out and the deck's gone and things are broken into. The officers, I'm talking about the officers, they suffer the consequences, and now we want citizens to go and sit down in a pen, which I call a pen at Golden Grove, right across the road, and now have monies to be attended to. That sets some stuff, Madam President, that we don't want in the system. So, not only there is an administrative issue, there's a security issue. There is a regulation issue that needs to be addressed. And added to that, the system, the judicial system, is not getting better in Trinidad and Tobago. There are people who are imprisoned. They found 2 sticks of marijuana in the fob, in the little pocket. If you don't know what a fob is, for the modern people, the older folks will know what a fob is. Senator, the Honorable Khan, you know what a fob is. The young people don't know what a fob is. So you don't know what a fob is? Oh, good. A fob. And this young guy said to me, I am in here now for 2.5 years awaiting a case to call. Madam President, why don't we have a ticket system for things like that? A man is found cussing, the police issue him a ticket, he chooses to go and pay it, or it's like a ticket. A ticket that he don't have to go to court. I'm certain if you found using obscene language, you give him a ticket, he goes and he pays it by the court. He done with that. You understand where I'm coming from? But you lock him up, you drive him down the next morning to the court grants him bail, and then he can't afford it. Because the bail is far greater than what the ticket would have been anyway. And he is locked up in jail, in remand yard. He is subjected to all kinds of cruelty. I was looking at the prison rules, the prison regulations. And Madam President, the entire prison system is a breach of the prison regulations. Absolute breach of the prison regulations when it comes to health, when it comes to everything else. And so he's locked up inside there, am I right? I'm 100% correct. And he's locked up in there, Madam President, so what? For obscene language or for 2 sticks of marijuana, and I'm not in any way advocating that people should be walking with marijuana, I'm not saying that. But he's locked up for that. He loses his job. His family suffers. His children suffers. When he could be given a ticket, and he go and pay the ticket. Easy stuff. Or there could be a petty crimes.
Senator Samuel, please. I just need you're putting things in context, but you're going away. You're letting the context take you away from what we are dealing with here. So I would just ask you to be a little more focused. Okay?
Madam President, cash bail pertains, and bail pertains to people who, one, and this bill wants to justify or to help 1,000 people who are in the system, who are incarcerated, in remand, who are suffering for a while, and I was just trying to bear out some of the sufferings because these people are being attended to by this particular amendment in the Act. And we are attempting to help them, but there are flaws in the attempt. Correct. As a matter of fact, as I always quoted, good intentions, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Madam President, so without data, we are now amending things and there is no justification. As a matter of fact, I would love the Learned Attorney General to really clarify if this amendment will deal with the serious administrative flaws in the system. Administrative flaws that seems to be unrecorded. Madam President, because of this, we now are faced with trying to cover up poor system by amendments and enactments of new laws. We're trying to cover up the flaws. In foreign jurisdictions, Madam President, and it doesn't happen here. According to an article, Crime by Isaac Avilucia, dated the 13th of the 10th, 2016, Madam President. In foreign jurisdictions, cash bail, it may work because defendants who are detained without bail are guaranteed a right to a speedy trial. So a person who is detained without bail knows for sure that the case is going to call. Knows for sure that the trial will come up. That doesn't happen here. So we're now resorting to a system that will kind of appear to ease the problems, but is not easing the problems. There may be more problems involved in the problems we are attempting to ease.
Easy tension.
In foreign jurisdictions, and I hope that the Attorney General would listen, bail reform is supposed to make the criminal justice system more fair and equitable for poor defendants. And the way they do that, Madam President, in talking about bail, is judges and magistrates will use what is called a risk assessment tool, which considers a host of factors about each defendant that will guide decisions at detention hearings that must be held within 2 days of someone being arrested. You see how quick? You see how swift, Madam President? It is very, very, very important that besides we coming here to say, let's give bail and cash bail to people, and that is a flaw because there are a lot of people, and it has been reiterated over and over, who cannot even attract the attention of a professional bailer or an illegal professional bailer, if I may put it that, because we are clear that it's illegal, and even though it's illegal, magistrates and judges accept the illegal bailers who come and do an illegal act, but they accept it as legal. And Madam President, these people cannot attract those people. Why? Because first and foremost, you have to have some means of down payment. And if you do...
Honourable Senators, at this juncture, we will suspend and we will return at 6 p.m. So this sitting is suspended until 6 p.m.